So yeah, thanks for joining. And this is all about this 100 days for climate and nature. And this is all basically trying to build the momentum around the climate and nature bill, building on all the excellent work that we did over the election campaign. We now have more supporting MPs, more supporting organisations, faith groups than we've ever had before. So this is a really, really key moment for this. And over the course of this evening, we're going to be hearing from members of our team about how you can play your part, about why this legislation is so urgently needed. And we'll have a short Q&A at the end just for any questions about the bill or about the process that we're going to be going through this evening. And we're joined, as I mentioned, we're joined by members of our team, including Amy and Oliver, co-directors, Jamie, who's our grassroots manager, who many of you will know from other calls, as well as Dr. Charlie Gardner and Professor E.J. Milner Gullard, who's also here. And they'll be speaking a little bit about the science of the bill, about why it's so important that we have a science-led legislation around climate and nature. So I'm going to pass on now to Amy and Oliver. They're going to be speaking a little bit about what we're going to be doing in these 100 days and why this moment is so exciting. So maybe I'll start with Oliver.
Thanks, Alan. Nice to see everyone here. As Alan was saying, we had a very successful election. Together, we persuaded 1,040 main party candidates to back the bill. And since the 4th of July, that means we now have 161 supporting MPs in Parliament, which is over a quarter. And as before, we are still and remain the largest cross-party climate and nature platform in Westminster, and even stronger. And we are confident of growing that number of supporting MPs. And that was sort of quite evident last Wednesday, when you may have seen from our social media or newsletter that we immediately went to number 10 to call on Keir Starmer as Prime Minister to back the Climate and Nature Bill. That photograph that you may have seen of 40 MPs joining us for that moment was apparently the largest ever group of MPs joining a petition. So we're very pleased about that. And the really interesting tidbits that we got from MPs who joined us was that the CAN bill request was often the most lobbied issue that they'd been asked to support ahead of the election. So that fills us with a lot of hope, and we should all be quite proud of that. Of course, we now have a new government, a new Labour government, and we're operating in a different landscape, to say the least, from the last party. We have started to see some positive shifts, as you may have seen already, especially around early signs of renewable energy. And today, as we might talk about later, reviewing our current biodiversity targets and the implementation of those. But we believe that the moment now demands more than tinkering around the edges. We hope that the Labour Party in government does a lot more than that. And the case for the Climate and Nature Bill being a clear, a viable, a joined-up plan to tackle, as the Labour Party manifesto itself said, is the greatest long-term global challenge we face, remains critical. So we are pushing in this 100 days to ensure that the government really sets the tone for what they are going to do next. We are opening, I think, an 18-month parliamentary session as part of this new 5-year parliament, and this type of action can't wait until either the next session or the next parliament. We are too close to 2030 to take the action that we need to take. So with your help, we need this new government to step up at this historic moment, follow the science, and commit to the CAN bill, which Amy is going to talk about a bit more.
Brilliant, thanks, Oliver. Yeah, so good to see so many of you here today. It's really, really exciting, and particularly, as Alan is saying, off the back of all of your hard work with the election campaign. So it's really exciting to progress that now and think about new steps in this new landscape that we're facing. So with this first 100 days, we've got a real golden opportunity with the bill that we're very excited about. And this opportunity is a private members' bill ballot. So this could allow us to really propel the bill forwards, and it will help us make as much noise inside Parliament as possible, which is obviously what we're always trying to do. It's on the 5th of September. So on the 5th of September, 20 MPs will be selected and drawn from this ballot. And those MPs are able to introduce whichever bill they like, and that bill will be prioritised. So this gives them the best chance of being able to, like I said, fast track and get this legislation moving. So we want to make sure that all of our MPs are primed, are ready to go, know they need to enter the ballot, and if they're drawn in that top set, that they're ready to introduce the climate and nature bill. So yeah, we hope that this will be a really big wake-up call as well for the new Labour government, and that by using every lever that we have in our power, that we can really make sure that they just can't ignore us. And of course, to be able to do all of this stuff, we can never do it without you. Us in Parliament by ourselves doesn't go anywhere. We really need you on the ground as constituents, being by our side all the way. So we're like I said, very pleased to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much. And yeah, now I think will be a good moment for us to introduce some of the scientists who helped draft the bill. So the first question I'm going to introduce is to Dr. Charlie Gardner, who's with us here. I'm just going to quickly I've got a bit of internet problems, but the question for Charlie is, as one of the scientists that helped draft the bill, can you tell us why this bill is so urgently required and why existing legislation is no longer sufficient to address the climate and nature crisis?
Thanks, Alan, and thanks everyone for being here. We all know that we're in the depths of a planetary emergency, and I'm not going to regale you with statistics, but I think the last few months have been a really striking one for many of us. We've really seen this emergency unfolding at record pace with our own eyes. You know, we had this incredibly record-breakingly wet winter in spring, and now over the summer we're really seeing our nature suffering. Lots of people have noticed, you know, a near absence of butterflies and other pollinating insects. And I think these are a real example of how the nature and climate crises act in synergy. You know, of course, we have these long-term insect declines caused by use of pesticides in intensive agriculture and habitat destruction, you know, typical threats to biodiversity. But now with this series of really unusual weather events over the last few years, this wet spring now, we're also seeing climate impacts on biodiversity. And we really, you know, it just goes to show we can't conserve the nature that we love without addressing climate change. And of course, we can't address climate change without conserving nature. And EJ is going to speak about that later. So we're in the depths of an emergency. And of course, we have some existing legislation both to address climate change and to address the destruction of nature. When it comes to nature, we have the Environment Act, which became law in 2021. And this calls for halting the continued loss of species by 2030. And that's a start, but it's a really inadequate target given the immensity of the nature crisis that we face. For one, it only talks about halting the decline of biodiversity, but we already have far too little of it. So halting it at a level that is far too low is, of course, insufficient. We don't need to just stop destroying it. We need to restore it, not just to conserve species and the beautiful places we love, but also to address climate change. The Environment Act is also, it's got quite a really narrow focus. So the target is on stopping the decline of species, but species is only one measure of nature. And in the Climate and Nature Act, we talk about stopping the destruction and then restoring not just species, but also populations of species, habitats, and ecosystems. So it's got this much more holistic approach. And we don't just talk about stopping declines, but we don't just talk about abundance, but we talk about diversity and resilience of these ecosystems to really make sure we can change the direction of nature and make sure it's in as good a health as possible. Our current legislation in the UK, so of course, one of the big dangers to nature in the UK is development. Our current legislation is very focused on allowing developers to destroy nature and then offsetting it somewhere else, which of course is very problematic in many ways. So the Climate and Nature Bill focuses on a mitigation hierarchy. So the first thing you need to do is avoid the destruction, and that's really important. The Environment Act also, it focuses really on biodiversity in the UK, and it doesn't have sufficient focus on the impacts of our consumption on biodiversity in other places. We're at the rich end of global supply chains, and the things we buy are causing deforestation and wetland drainage and all these other things elsewhere. And the Climate and Nature Bill will make sure that we integrate that fully. The other thing that's really important is that the Environment Act, it includes targets, but it doesn't include, the steps required to get there. And this is a real strength of the Climate and Nature Bill, which I'll talk about in a second when I talk about climate change. So when it comes to climate change, we have the Climate Change Act, but this dates from 2008. It's really, really old, and it's based on old science. So apart from anything else, it needs updating. It's based on a target of decarbonizing our entire economy by 2050, net zero by 2050. But the big problem there is that it's not when you stop emitting that really matters. It's how much you emit in the meantime. It's cumulative emissions. And this end date of 2050 is hugely problematic. Like we saw with the previous government when they were launching plans for the Whitehaven coal mine in Cumbria. They said, they literally said, it's okay, it's compatible with our climate change plans because it will stop producing coal in 2049. It's just, it's crazy nonsense, really, but it's the sort of crazy nonsense that can happen when you have poor, distant targets that don't call for an implementation plan. And this is one of the things that I really, really like about the Climate and Nature Bill, is that it doesn't just set targets. It requires the Secretary of State to produce a plan of implementation to allow us to meet those targets. And that's really what's missing at the moment. So, for example, the last government, they implemented their they set their decarbonization target, but because it didn't have interim targets and it didn't have a plan of action, they never put in place policies that would allow them to meet those targets. So, you have crazy incompatible things like new oil and gas exploration in the North Sea, a new coal mine, airport expansion, £27 billion road building program, still building new houses to such poor standards that they're going to have to be immediately retrofitted. Well, with the Climate and Nature Bill, none of that would happen because the Secretary of State would be obliged to put in place a plan of action with annual interim targets. It's also the case that our domestic decarbonization targets just aren't up to scratch because they're, it's sort of impartial accounting. We focus on what we call territorial emissions, so the emissions that are generated within the UK, but that doesn't include all the emissions from our consumption, all the stuff we import from Asia and everything else. It doesn't include emissions from aviation and shipping. So, the Climate and Nature Bill brings all that together under our umbrella, makes us take responsibility for our emissions as a rich nation. There are a few other really, really lovely things about the bill that that are focused on justice and making the transition fair, that are focused on consensus building and making sure everyone has a say. I've gone on quite a lot. I would, if we get an opportunity to speak about the Climate and Nature Assembly, I'd love to chat about that later, but otherwise I'll pass back to you, Alan.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we will make some time to speak about the importance of citizens' assemblies and bringing people along with us.
Sorry, could I just add one little thing? There's one crucial thing that I forgot to mention. Existing climate legislation doesn't talk about ending fossil fuels, which is ridiculous because, of course, they are the primary cause of climate change. You can't. It's a bit weird and silly to have a decarbonisation target without talking about ending the thing that will allow you to meet that. So the Climate and Nature Bill is very explicit about ending not just fossil fuel exploration and production, but also imports too, and that's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And we're going to move on to a question for Professor E.J. at Milner Gullard here, which is about that joint up. How do we interconnect climate and nature? So a key part of that is speaking about this joint up approach. So why is cross-departmental approach so critical to halting and reversing nature loss?
Super, thank you. And just before I talk about that, I'd like to say that I'm really proud to have been involved in drafting this part of the biodiversity part, particularly of the Climate and Nature Bill. And that's because one of the things that we signed up to as a government and as a country, and in fact, we were leaders in this, was the Convention on Biological Diversity's Global Biodiversity Framework, which was 2 years late because of COVID, but it was signed in 2022. And the kind of headline mission of the Global Biodiversity Framework, signed by 196 countries, all countries except North Korea and the USA, make of that what you will. So that the headline target of that is to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity by 2030. That is something that we played a leading part in getting everybody else in the world to sign up to. And yet we do not have legislation that requires us to do that. And I can't believe that we think that we can take a leadership role in the world without actually having the legislation in place to enable us to do it in our own backyard. So joined up government. One thing to say is that it's really, really important that the Climate and Nature Bill is both climate and nature, and that they're given equal prominence, because very often people forget about nature and biodiversity, or they see it as a secondary issue to climate change. Climate change is a fundamental existential threat to our existence. So is nature loss. And they're both urgent and they're both happening now and fast. And just as Charlie was talking about the symptoms of climate change that we're seeing all around us, we're also seeing the symptoms of nature loss all around us. There's been a lot of chatter at the moment around the lack of insects and butterflies this year, which is partly to do with the particular weather that we've had this year, which is likely climate change, but it's also partly to do with the long-term trend in decline in our insect life. So when you have a long-term trend in decline, then kind of year-to-year variation is even worse. The reason why it matters that we're losing nature hand over fist is that nature underpins our life support system. So it underpins our clean water through flood mitigation. It underpins our food supplies, not just through pollination, but through kind of genetic variation. It underpins our clean air, and so on and so on. So and also our kind of well-being and health, not just mental health, but also physical health, and also through the reduction in transmission of infectious disease. So we need biodiversity, and we need to do something to halt that decline. And that is separate from, although intertwined with, climate. So a lot of the things that happen to biodiversity are related to climate change, but currently still, most of the biodiversity loss is to do with overexploitation, so too much harvesting of timber and fish from our seas. It's to do with invasive species, which we're bringing in by our global trade, which is not properly biosecure. It's to do with pollution. Just think about the River Wye. Think also about things like pesticides that are getting into our waters at levels that are far insupportable for our wildlife. And it's also importantly to do with the land use change, land conversion for agriculture, largely agriculture that is going towards producing animal feeds. So we have these big things that are intertwined with, but not the same as climate change. And of course, also, as we all know, nature is our biggest ally against climate change. You know, healthy, resilient ecosystems are going to help us to weather climate change, to adapt to and to mitigate climate change. And so they're intertwined in that way as well. So I think it's really important that the bill has both separately and together. The other thing you mentioned was about the whole of government approach. And I think that's really important because the Environment Act actually only covers the England and Wales to some extent. It doesn't cover the whole of the UK. And it's also coming out of DEFRA. It's not coming out of the whole of government. But what we actually need is to have our Treasury, our Health Ministry, our business, our Home Office and Foreign Office, our overseas aid and so on, all pulling in the same direction, because climate and nature loss are a financial, economic and health and well-being issue across the whole of government. So unless the whole of government actually pulls in the same direction, we're not going to make it. And I'm really quite keen to go to the questions, so I think I'm going to leave it there.
Great, thank you so much. And the last question, I guess, is just for both yourself and for Charlie, which is quite a short one, and it will segment into how people can play their role, which is we have lots of new MPs in this new session of Parliament, and it's important that we communicate the urgency of what the science is saying is needed. So can you give any sort of, what's your tip, what's your message for how to effectively communicate the science to make that really hit home for these new MPs? I don't know who would like to start.
You want to go first, Charlie?
Please do.
Me? Okay, I shall then. So I guess my approach always is to think about the opportunity as well as the crisis. You know, I think we need to have some kind of positive way forward for people to realize that actually we're in a hole, but we can get out of it. You know, and in particular, when you think about nature, it's incredibly resilient. And if we take the foot off the pedal, if we allow nature the space that it needs to recover, it can recover quickly. And we're still in with the opportunity to do that. And if you just look at rewilding sites, if you look at places where water has been cleaned up, you get nature coming back with a vengeance quickly. So it's not too late. We have to move forward quickly, though. And the other thing is that it's an opportunity for doing something that is genuinely of interest to the public. You know, I think sometimes we think, well, maybe nobody really cares, but all the opinion polls suggest that the public really does care about climate change and it really does care about nature. You just need to think about how people felt about Sycamore Gap when the tree was lost. So it's something where, if done right, we can bring citizens along with us. Of course, there are difficult trade-offs. Of course, there are difficult conversations to be had around how do we make a transition that is socially just, that is fair, that doesn't leave communities behind. And that's partly why we need to talk about deliberative democracy, which is something that Charlie mentioned before. But it is something where we can bring our public with us. Charlie?
Thanks. So my message for MPs is that you know, it's now or never really. It's make or break time. So, you know, successive governments have been passing the buck. We've been aware of these both these critical issues for decades, and successive governments have just been leaving it to their successors to deal with. But we can't do that anymore. So, you know, the IPCC say we need to halve our carbon emissions by 2030. 2030 is no longer a distant future target. It is you know, these MPs will be in session, will be sitting MPs until 2030. So it's up to them now. In terms of communicating to them, I think there's a few things that could be useful. One, I think, is don't be afraid of being a real person as a constituent. You know, when we talk about science, we tend to communicate in facts and figures a lot, but actually, you know, psychology research shows that using emotive languages, emotive arguments is much more powerful and persuasive. So show why you care, tell them why you're worried, why you're afraid. I think being empathetic might be a good idea as well. So there was a researcher called Rebecca Willis who did research amongst parliamentarians. She wrote this amazing little book called Too Hot to Handle, and she found that what a big barrier for them is just the enormity of the challenge. They're terrified of the enormity of the challenge, and they don't know what to do. I'm just one little old MP. What can I do against all this? So I think empathizing with them, you know, making them feel good about the enormity of the challenge and their courage for taking this on and stuff. But I think also the Climate and Nature Assembly could be a bit of a sort of trump card in that respect, because this is a mechanism that allows MPs to pass off the difficult decisions onto the public, essentially. So it's a really useful tool to allow them to make these difficult decisions, and I think presenting it that way might be useful. And then the third thing is just you know, read up about your MP, think about their values, and compose your arguments based on their values, not based on, you know, what would be a compelling argument to you. And of course, when we talk about conserving nature and climate change, lots of that is compatible with very conservative values. You know, talk about pride in our heritage. You know, both these things. The fiscally responsible thing to do is take action on both these crises. That's the cheapest way to do. So there are some very, you know, we can appeal to the values of people that are on the different side of the political spectrum to us. So think about that too, I think.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I think it's such a vital point, that feeling of what is their interest, because we did a training earlier in the year with Hope for the Future, and that's what they were saying, is whether they're interested in sport, whether they're interested in agriculture and farming, whether it's about health, whatever their main sort of drive for being an MP intersects with what's happening to climate and nature. So it's a really pivotal point. I think that's really great. I'm going to now introduce Jamie from our team at Zero Hour. He's just going to be speaking a little bit about how you can get involved, how you can advance this bill before we move on to a Q&A. So Jamie, if you'd like to jump in and let us know how people can get involved.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alan. And a huge thank you to our scientists as well for outlining the urgency of the situation so brilliantly. It's incredibly sobering to hear the crisis being laid out in that way by experts in their field, but it's also incredibly empowering to hear you both talking about the fact that we have science-led solutions that we can use to tackle this huge crisis. We just need the political will in order to do that. And I guess that's my part of this talk, is just thinking about what we can do as campaigners and as constituents in order to really ensure that that political will is there. I'm going to outline our campaign that we're looking at for the next 100 days, which is the new government's first 100 days in office. I'm just going to share my screen with you, and hopefully you can see that. So many of you on this call, I know, joined us as campaigners during the election, where we asked you to reach out to individuals, organisations, and the candidates who are standing for election in your constituencies. You've heard Oliver and Amy talk about this, but that was a huge success for us, that campaign. Our sources in Westminster tell us that there's now, you know, a buzz around the climate and nature bill that is greater than has ever been before, because so many of you reached out to those candidates and raised the CAN bill with them as an election issue. And so people are really talking about it in the corridors of power now. It's probably fair to say that the election has changed the political landscape completely. We now have a new government. The government has a mandate to deliver change. That's what it was. That one word was really what it was elected on. But while it's very easy for the new Labour government to look good in comparison with their predecessors, the key for us is to ensure that they look good when compared to what the science says is necessary for us to avoid disaster. It's pretty obvious at this point that tinkering around the edges of this crisis isn't enough. New solar farms aren't enough. Tackling sewage in the river isn't enough. Ending new oil and gas licenses, while brilliant, isn't enough. As you've heard from EJ and Charlie, the science really demands much more. So our 100 Days campaign is really looking at ways in which we can ensure that the new government supports the Climate and Nature Bill in its first 100 days in office. And that's basically between the start of the government and around about mid-October. That'll be the 100 days. So we're looking at asking campaigners to do three quite simple things during the next 100 days. Firstly, we're going to ask you to lobby your MP. We really want you to make that personal connection with them. We want you to write to them. We want you to tweet to them, engage them on social media. Whether they supported they already support the CAM bill or not doesn't actually matter in this phase. We really want you to be asking them to make sure that they will make the CAM bill a priority during the ballot bill process that's happening this autumn. And in order to do that, we're really going to lean on the science, and we're really going to impress on them the urgency of making sure that that science is in the forefront of their minds as they're thinking about government policy. The second thing we're going to be asking to do is for you to meet your MP. I know some of you might think this is a little bit scary, but on a human level, that connection between you and your representative is really important. We will be offering you training and support in order to help you through that process. Where possible, we'll be encouraging you maybe to go along with other local campaigners, possibly also, I know lots of you have reached out to organisations in your constituencies during the election process. So there may be connections there that you could invite someone maybe from the local wildlife trust or something like that to come along with you, local businesses, charities, faith groups, to come along and meet your MP in that way. And the aim of that meeting will be to deliver something really interesting, which is going to be a scientist's letter that we are asking all the supporting scientists of the CAM bill to sign, and we're going to deliver it to MPs to impress on them the urgency of the science and the fact that this really is the last government that is going to be able to affect change in order to meet those 2030 targets. So regardless of what parties the MPs are from, your MP is from, regardless of whether or not they already support the bill, there really is an opportunity here to put pressure on them and to leverage it in that way. And that personal connection between you and them is a really key way of doing that. As I said, we'll have some training coming up. We can help you along with that process. And the final part of this is we're inviting you all to attend a very special rally with us in the House of Commons, which will be with party leaders in early October. And at this rally, we're going to have some leading UK scientists who are going to be calling on the government quite literally to support the CAM bill before the end of its first 100 days in office. It really is the only way that the UK is going to meet its international obligations for those 2030 climate and nature targets, is if the government actually gets behind this. So it really is our job as campaigners and citizens to make sure that the government follows the science. And as the little graphic there shows, if you've ever watched a disaster movie, you will know that it starts with the government ignoring the scientists, and that's what they've been doing for an awful long time. So this really is our opportunity to kind of change that narrative by going through these 3 stages in just between now and the middle of October. And to help you with your campaigning, we have an updated campaigner pack. Put the link, and the link will appear in the chat, hopefully in a second. And there are also some new campaign materials, which are just being printed this week. So we've got some new leaflets, posters, stickers and badges, all of that wonderful stuff to help you spread the word in your constituencies. Now, over the last few months, as I said, we've really seen the amazing power of you as campaigners for the CAM bill to affect change during the election. That constituency-based pressure that we saw in terms of you reaching out to candidates, in making the CAM bill a central part of the noise around the election campaign, really worked in an incredible way. Every email, every tweet, every time you spoke to a candidate really helped build that pressure up. And so now is the time for us to put that pressure on your new MPs. We have a new government. And we have between now and the 16th of October to ensure that the government backs the science. This campaign is all about making sure that your MP enters the private members bill ballot to pressure the government into backing the CAN bill in its first 100 days in office. So we'd love it if you downloaded our new campaigner pack and had a look at our Right to MP tool. And regardless of whether you've spoken to them before or not, send your MP an email and really ask them to back the science and back the CAN bill. Thank you. I'll pass back to Alan.
Thanks, Jamie, and that's really great to hear. You know, we've got lots of ways to get involved. Some of the links have already been put in the chat, which is great. Thanks, Felix, for sharing them, but we will be sending it out by email, so you will get direct links to all of these different tools we've been creating. And please do join us on that training about engaging the MP, because it really does help just make it seem a lot less intimidating and a lot more human, like Charlie had mentioned earlier. So that sort of empathy and compassion can just sometimes get through to them when you don't think they would. And you touched on this, but this is a question we had in the comments, so I'm going to start with this one. If my MP is already on board, so they already back the climate and nature bill, what else can I do to help the process? Perhaps Amy or Oliver, you want to come in on how they can help?
Yep, I can go. I'm really pleased this question came up, because I was thinking it actually as we were speaking at the end there, that I'd sneak in with the response to this anyway. So this is fantastic. Brilliant. And I'm seeing in the chat that people have had new MPs join up since the election, and so there does seem to be a really big momentum, which is really fantastic. If your MP supports the bill already, if they don't support the bill already, we need them to enter the private members bill ballot, and we will be sending around all details on this, as Alan said, in an email tomorrow, I believe, about this first stage in our 100 days campaign, which is to write a personal email to your MP if they back, if they don't back, regardless of party, asking if they will put into the ballot, and if they are drawn, if they will choose the climate and nature bill to introduce. So that's really what we want, as many MPs ready and primed to do as possible ahead of the 5th of September. Yeah, exactly. And I guess a small anecdote from my own personal experiences, that was my first thought when my new MP, who was already supporting the bill, said he was backing it. The first thought I did actually have was, well, not all of his colleagues are. So it is exactly that. You can say to them, speak to your other colleagues about the importance of this bill, and this CAN bill process will be key to that. I think it might be a good moment to actually bring in, you touched on it before, Charlie, about what's the importance of climate and nature assemblies? What role do they play, do you think, in bringing everyone along with us?
Thanks, Alan. Well, these mechanisms have different names. I'm sure you've all heard of them, but just in case anybody hasn't. So our climate and nature assembly is based on a model of citizens' assemblies, which is a form of deliberative democracy, participatory democracy, which sort of devolves decision making from politicians to ordinary citizens who are randomly selected in a representative way, so that the whole country is represented. And I think it's very clear that we are in dire need of a new form of politics. As we said before, these crises have been going on for decades, and we've had all the information we need about them for decades. And it's also been the case that these have been major concerns of the British public. Polling for many, many years has shown how concerned people are about nature and climate change. So we have this weird situation where everybody knows these things need to be done. The public is overwhelmingly in favor of these things being done, and yet our governments don't do them. So there's clearly a big problem with our decision-making processes there. And for me, that problem, to a large extent, comes down to corporate lobbying, really, to to the special interests of private interests who, destructive industries, carbon-intensive industries, nature-destroying industries have spent just incredible amounts of money for a long, long time on preventing the implementation of legislation that would stop them doing their business. Now, participatory democracies are a way of getting decisions made away from the influence of these corporate lobbyists. They've been fantastically successful in the past, and increasingly used by governments around the world. The classic example is from the Republic of Ireland, where they wanted to tackle the very, very politically sensitive topic of whether to legalize abortion. And this was something that politicians were very, very wary of going anywhere near, because as soon as you adopt a position on that, then you've alienated half the population. So they said, well, we can't make a decision. Let's hand it over to a citizens' assembly. The citizens' assembly decided on having a referendum. They had the referendum, and abortion was legalized. So it's a really good way of making difficult decisions. It's a good way of making decisions away from special interests. But I think there are also really good reasons for having participatory decision-making processes. I mean, firstly, by the greater the diversity of perspectives that you consider at the beginning of making a policy, the better that policy will be, just clearly. It's also very important from the point of view of fairness. We are embarking on a massive economic transition. Economic transitions involve losers, often laborers in the dying industries. This is something that the bill has a particular focus, but beyond the bill's particular focus on justice elements, I think having a citizens' assembly also ensures that justice element. And of course, it's very, very important for bringing everybody along with us. This is a huge transition. Sacrifices will have to be made. The very wealthiest in our society will have to bring down their levels of consumption. And we do, of course, have a big organized ecosystem of obstructionists and delayists, right-wing think tanks and press, who are trying to persuade the public that net zero will be a terrible thing and it'll be bad for you and it'll be expensive for you and you'll lose all your freedoms. And so it's really, really important that we have this participatory approach to ensure that we bring everybody along with us, because any hint of conflict or division across society will be manipulated by the obstructionists.
Yeah, that's a very comprehensive answer, and it's so important, that sense of how do we bring people along, because it's reshaping aspects of society that serve us all. On that idea of participation, there's actually a question we can directly go into, which is for people collaborating in their area, how someone's asking how they can be put in touch with other campaigners and other supporters in their local area. Perhaps Jamie's best suited to mention that.
Yes, thank you, Alan. A great way to do this is to join our WhatsApp community. The link is in the campaigner pack, which is somewhere in the chat, and will be circulated around tomorrow. That's a really good way. If you jump in there, you can hopefully find someone who's in your local area. If you don't have any luck, then please do reach out to us via the 0 Hour website, and we can try and find people in your local area to help you collaborate with.
Great, thank you. I've got a very practical question, but practical questions are good. This is probably one for Amy or Oliver, which is when is the deadline for, if you're speaking to your MP, asking them to enter the ballot, when's the deadline for the last time that they can say, I'm supporting the bill and I'm going to introduce that to Parliament?
Sure. So the deadline for MPs to enter this private members' bill ballot is the 4th of September. So there are 2 days on which they can do it. This is not a currently open rolling process. The book, and it is a physical book, for entry is open on the 3rd and the 4th of September. The draw is Thursday, the 5th of September. So Felix has written up a blog about this that he can include in the chat, which I think he has done. But for the purposes of contacting your MPs, there is no need to go into that detail. Asking them by the 4th of September to do this is brilliant in itself.
Great, thank you. Another question about how do we work together is a question about how can unions get involved? What's our relationship with the role of unions in supporting the bill?
I can answer that as well quickly. We have a partnership with the National Education Union and the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union. The Greener Jobs Alliance, which is made up of climate representatives from the main unions, is also on board. But if you are a member or know any members of unions yourselves, please do let them know that this is something that we'd welcome their support for. It may not be something that all unions want to get behind, and we possibly know who some of those unions are. But if you are a member of a union, then please help us grow the alliance for this bill. They can be incredibly powerful, especially if they're affiliated to the Labour Party. So yeah, that would be helpful. Great,
thank you. Yeah, and we have, alongside unions, as we've mentioned, we've got lots of organisations who support, and sort of something touches on a previous question, but about how do you connect with local people in your area? Not necessarily about individuals, but about looking at organisation support. There's a website which we'll put in the chat, action.zerohour.uk. We used it for all of our constituency work around the election, and it will show you some of those national support and some of the local support, because we also work with local authorities trying to get motions passed, so you can see who is supporting, and it's a way to connect to campaigners that way too. So yeah, there's another quite interesting idea in here, which is we spoke about writing to your MP using our digital tool. It's very quick, which is good, but it's also going on to something that Charlie and AJ mentioned earlier, is how do you really connect to your MP? The question here is, why not write a letter to your MP and mail it in? And there's also a bit of chat in the chat box about local writing letter groups, and maybe I'll just quickly touch on that, which is, I think this is actually really, really effective. We've done something similar before, which we can share, where we have these postcards that people can put to their MP, and it's a way that you can physically writing something. They don't always get it into, they don't get it as much. They get a lot of emails, so it's a way of making that personal connection. And the letter writing thing's a really good way of saying, how do you tell that personal story? It's also something you can do not just to your MP, but also, write to your local paper about why you're concerned by this and why you think this legislation can be an opportunity. So I think that's a really good point raised. Okay, on to the next question. So there's a question here which, whoever feels they know the most can jump in. What do we know about other bills that might be on the table that might be also going for this ballot bill process? Is there, and why, and where does this sit in all of that? What's the balance between other bills and what we're pushing for? This slightly was touched on by Charlie, but perhaps Amy, you want to jump in and.
Yeah, I can begin. Oliver, you might want to add to it as well. I think the main thing to say here actually is, by doing all this work of reaching out to our MP, and as many people as possible do that in as many constituencies as possible, then it gives us a really good idea of the landscape, which is incredibly helpful. And a second thing to say is, even if your MP, if you hear from somebody else in your constituency that your MP is going to enter another bill, or that you hear just, I don't know, on the winds that that's the case, then please do carry on and still write and still pile on the pressure, because we've got until now, until the 4th of September. So there's a good amount of time to really make sure that they know that constituents in their local area are wanting them to support this urgent legislation for climate and nature. But would you add to that, anyone else in the team?
No, good. We've also got a question here. This is a little bit about that. How do you bring people along? Which is saying, I'd like to ask the panelists about their views on solar farms. Lots of reports are about how does that balance with impacts to local wildlife and food growing. Have you got any sort of thoughts on that? Maybe EJ, you want to come in on that?
I was literally typing an answer, actually. So that's handy.
Perfect timing.
What I was typing is that we need to lobby for as much solar on roofs as possible. So, for example, my institution where I work has been thinking about the extent to which they could actually cover the roofs of of our buildings with solar panels that aren't even necessarily visible. And recently, King's College Chapel in Cambridge University, which was built by Henry VIII, has had solar panels put on its roof. So you can get around planning permission even for ancient buildings. And I think, certainly the calculations we've done suggest that our clean energy could be met by our roofs. The other thing is to focus on things like combined heat and power, distributed heating in cities. We don't necessarily need to jump straight to what looks like the cheapest option, but in fact is not the cheapest option when you think about food production and nature. If solar farms are going to be put on existing kind of greenfield land, then there are small scale community firms that are doing a good job of promoting nature within the farm, and or on the continent, for example, they have very high up solar farms that allow you to grow crops underneath so that you can have two together. So there are ways forward, but they don't include large scale commercial solar farms that blitz nature and don't have any use for food production either.
Great, thank
Could
you.
I just add to that, Alan?
Yeah,
Sorry.
of course.
I think this is an example of just why it's so important that we address climate and nature synergistically through the bill, because so many of the sort of climate solutions that are being developed and implemented are being done with a really single-minded focus on carbon, but they're having really negative or can potentially have negative impacts on biodiversity. So the classic example is tree planting. Everyone loves tree planting because it's a nice, easy way to look like you're doing something instead of decarbonizing. And of course, tree planting or letting woodlands naturally regenerate could be a wonderful opportunity for biodiversity, but it's not, because people are just doing it the cheapest way possible, and they're just planting monocultures of pines and things. And if you plant a tree in a delicate natural woodland, you're not creating a forest. Sorry, in a natural grassland, you're not creating a forest, you're destroying a grassland. And we see this all over. So not just solar farms, but wind farms, pylons, other renewable energy infrastructure in sensitive places. We have this ridiculous situation where the UK's largest power station is Drax, is burning trees from old growth forests for electricity. So we have, and as far as I'm concerned, any climate solution that negatively impacts nature is not a climate solution. But unless we have twin objectives of climate and nature out of these projects we're implementing, then nature will lose, and net zero will be an emerging threat to biodiversity. So we have to ensure we have twin climate and nature objectives from this entire transition.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're now coming to the end, so this is maybe a good time to wrap up and say thank you so much to Charlie and to EJ for joining and for your wonderful answers. And thank you to all of you for joining. We will be in touch about this campaigner pack and how we can engage with our MPs. We can take all of that momentum, because as Charlie Niji have made such an eloquent point about, is we need this joint up plan, and we need it now, and we all have a role to play, and we can really help push this further forward because we have more support than we've ever had before. So yeah, thank you all. This is recorded. We will be sharing this around. We will also be sharing those tools. And a few of our team will be staying on the call. So if you are really keen to get a few more questions answered with some of our team about the bill and what we're doing, or some of the resources we have, please stay online. Otherwise, thank you all for joining, and I really appreciate your time.